recording, and the recording is now in progress. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Austen. If you would introduce yourself for folks watching the recording and for the future as well for us tonight. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks so much, Carrie, and thanks for having me all. I'm excited to be here. My name is Austen. My pronouns are he, him. And I, gosh, what should I say to introduce myself? I work with trans and gender expansive folks. I serve as the executive director of an organization called Transmission Ministry Collective. That's a new nonprofit. We started at the same time as the pandemic, so we're like a year and a half and some months old. And we do support groups and workshops and Bible studies usually, although that's on pause at the moment, specifically for trans and gender expansive people. And it's all online, so you can access it from anywhere. So that's what I do generally. I also wrote a book called Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians that came out in 2018. And I think I'm now allowed to say that we're doing a second edition that's going to come out in fall of 2022. It's going to have more stuff in it, which I'm excited about. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I'm a trans guy. I grew up evangelical and now have been in the ELCA Lutheran Church for quite a few years. So that's my spiritual background a little bit. And I graduated from Luther Seminary. So my background in academia is in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. So that's me. So today, Carrie and Darren asked if I would come do a little bit of sort of like Trans 101, and also looking at some gender expansive folks in our history, and also a little bit about like how we can be better siblings and neighbors to our trans siblings and neighbors. So that's it's going to be a lot. So I'm going to go kind of fast to fit it all into an hour-ish. But I will send the slides to Carrie and Darren. So if you want to ask them for the slides afterwards, feel free to do that. And then you don't have to feel like you're like, oh gosh, I missed that thing in the slide. So having said that, can I share my screen? I think I need to have access to do that, and then I will share my screen. Thumbs up. I'm getting a thumbs up. There we go. Okay. Cool. So here we go. Let's get started. I always come into these things. I should say, first of all, I always come into these things assuming basically zero knowledge. And that's just because we don't want to, assume that folks are coming in with a certain amount of knowledge and say, oh, everybody knows this or that. So if you were like, oh, I already know this, Austen, then like you're ahead of the game. You're doing good. So don't feel bad if you don't know things before we get to it. Don't feel bad if you do know and you're like, all right, next slide. We'll get there, I promise. So let's start out. The first thing I want to do is just make a distinction between orientation and gender, because for some folks, I talk with parents of trans youth a lot, and some parents just get this general idea that because we talk about sort of the general LGBTQ plus community, that being trans is just being gay, but more so, just like gay 2.0, and then you become trans. So I always want to sort of make this distinction between orientation and gender. So for orientation, also called your sexual orientation, your affectional orientation, it describes the gender of the people you tend to be attracted to. So orientations that you might be familiar with are things like folks who are gay, lesbian, pansexual, bisexual, asexual. All those things are under the sort of umbrella of orientation. And that's not something that we can see, obviously, right? You can't tell somebody's orientation by looking at them. So what we tend to do is we make assumptions about people based on their affectional behavior, which are can be interpersonal things, small things like holding hands. They can be social traditions like marriage, all those things. So this all kind of has to do with who you are in relationship with, who you are attracted to, sexually, romantically, all those things. So separate from that is the concept of gender. And there are lots of different models for explaining what gender is and how gender works. The model that I'm using today is based off of the model created by Gender Spectrum, which is an organization out of San Francisco that works with trans youth. So this is kind of one of the ways they use to describe this. So they talk about gender as being made up of three parts or three facets that are all interconnected. So the first one is your body. So your internal and external reproductive organs, chromosomes, hormone levels, brain matter. All those things in your body that have what we would think of as sexed or gendered characteristics. We put meaning on those things, on those parts of our bodies. So that's sort of the body segment. Your gender identity is your internal self-perception and experience of being female, male, both, or neither. So one of the ways that in other models, the way we might say this is you have your sex and your gender, right? The sex being the body part and gender being the gender identity part. So that's another model or way of understanding this. The third part here is your gender expression. So this is the way that you show your gender to others through clothing, hair, mannerisms, voice, etc., which have gendered values in your particular society. So this is going to be different in different places in the world. So when we think about these three sort of building blocks of gender, one of the ways that we tend to talk about gender is we say gender is biopsychosocial. So three things that all kind of become one word. So it's bio, right? Biology, it has to do with our bodies. It's psychological, it has to do with our gender identity. And it's social, it has to do with how we present ourselves in the world and in relationship to other people. So biopsychosocial is one way that we would talk about gender. It's helpful to think about these three things as like having these three different parts, but the reality is that it's really hard to separate or like take apart these things from each other. Because for instance, if you think about like your gender identity happening in your brain, right? How you perceive of yourself. Well, your brain is part of your body and therefore it's like affected by things like your hormone levels, right? So even if we can kind of take these things apart to look at them more closely, theoretically, in practice, they're all very, very much intertwined. And different people are going to experience them differently. So another sort of piece of language here is you might hear the body part of this talked about as somebody's assigned sex. So all people get an assigned sex when they're born, or when they get, an ultrasound, or their parents get an ultrasound before birth. And we get assigned a sex based specifically on our external reproductive organs. And if you remember, going back to our other slide here, when we're talking about our body, we're not just talking about our external reproductive organs. There's like way more going on in our bodies than just that. But that's really the only thing that people look like when we get our assigned sex. So what that ends up meaning is that most people are endosex, meaning that they have sex characteristics that could be clearly assigned either male or female. That doesn't necessarily mean just external reproductive organs. That might mean looking at other parts of the body as well. But most people are endosex, meaning you can kind of look at them and go, all right, I'm putting you in this box or this box. But about 1.7% of people are intersex, meaning they have differences in sex development, or sex characteristic variations is another way of talking about that. So thinking about it, like 1.7% is a number that is kind of disputed. Some people think there are way more than that. Some people think there are less. It's just depending on how you define intersex, because there are lots of different intersex variations that have to do with like a whole bunch of different parts of the body. So when we're talking about or using the language of gender expansive, when we talk about gender expansive people, what does that mean? Gender expansive has kind of become a catch-all term to talk about people who express or identify their gender in non-normative ways. So sometimes when we're talking about gender expansive, usually what people mean are like people that are sort of that color outside the lines a little bit when it comes to gender. It can sometimes include transgender people, sometimes it includes intersex people, sometimes it includes gender non-conforming cisgender people. So people who aren't trans, but who just express their gender in ways that we might not expect for their assigned sex. So gender expansive kind of is this big catch-all term, and it works really well on, like, not really well, it works as best as we can. It's the best thing we have so far to talk about groups of people, but it doesn't always work really well on an individual level, because not all trans or intersex people would consider themselves gender expansive. For instance, I sometimes think of myself like as a transgender guy who is pretty binary in my feeling about like my own gender. Like I identify pretty much just as male. So for me, sometimes I'm like, gender expansive doesn't really describe me because like I look like people expect a guy to look in our particular culture, but I would consider myself part of a gender expansive community. So it's kind of a complex thing because it like works for groups, but doesn't always work very well for individuals. So I want to zoom in a little bit. We've talked about orientation and gender. We've talked about gender expansive as sort of this big term. Zooming a little bit more on transgender folks and the language that's used in trans communities. So transgender is in itself an umbrella term. So we're kind of looking at just like umbrellas within umbrellas here, right? It incorporates many different identities, all of them having to do with having a gender that is different from the sex you were assigned at birth. So that's sort of like the general definition. Cisgender is used to refer to people who have a gender and an assigned sex that match. So both trans and cis are Latin prefixes. Trans means across from, like transatlantic is another example of how you'd use trans as across from. Cis just means on the same side. So meaning like, does your assigned sex and your gender, do we kind of see them as different from each other or are they the same? So let's talk about some of the identities underneath sort of the trans umbrella. The one thing that I want to say, kind of prefacing all of these more specific identity labels, is that these are very general sketches of what these words mean. And anytime you talk to an individual, you always want to prioritize the individual's experience and definition of this word. So if you meet somebody who uses the label non-binary for themselves and you're like, oh, I've heard about that, Austen said something about that one time, but like this person identifies that word differently, go with what that person is saying. Always preference the individual's experience and definition of these words. But these are some general sketches. So identities that fall under the trans umbrella can include transgender men. So folks like me, people who are assigned female at birth, but know themselves to be male. You've got trans women who are people assigned male at birth, but know themselves to be female. You've got non-binary folks, and non-binary folks, non-binary is also sort of an umbrella term. So it's kind of, again, umbrellas within umbrellas here. A non-binary person has a gender identity that doesn't conform to the male-female binary. They may feel like a combination of male and female, or they may identify as a completely different gender altogether. So just as an example of like trans people having misconceptions about other trans people, right? Because like we all have misconceptions. At one point, when I was very early in my transition, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is non-binary. And I said, well, okay, you're non-binary, so that must mean that you feel both male and female, or you experience life as both male and female. And they said, actually, that's not true for me. My experience is more like, you know, we started thinking about gender as like a two-box system, male and female. And then we got to the point where we were like, maybe it's more of a spectrum. Okay, so maybe there's like some wiggle room in between these boxes. And they said, but for me, when I think about gender, I think about the fact that we are three-dimensional people. So why would we ever try to chart ourselves in a two-dimensional way? It doesn't work. So they said, for me, I think of my gender as more like a constellation. I'm not this box or the line between. I'm like over here. I'm like on a different plane in terms of gender. And I thought, oh, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. That like, it's not like just two boxes or a line between two things. It's like, well, we're three-dimensional people. Of course, we would never be able to explain ourselves in a two-dimensional way. So non-binary folks will have lots of different ways of explaining that. Yes, I love that, Wes. Gender is a galaxy. So agender folks. Agender folks may not have a sense of gender identity or may only experience that gender occasionally or at a different rate, in the same way that asexual folks might experience sexuality at in a lesser extent or at a different rate than other folks. And gender fluid folks might experience their gender as something that changes over time. So it might change day to day. It might be the kind of thing where day to day you get up and you're like, okay, this is the thing that makes sense for me. This makes me feel in alignment with myself. It may be something that happens like over the course of years. And gender queer is I think my personal feeling is that genderqueer is the hardest word to give a definition for, in the same way that queer is like one of the hardest words to give a definition for, because it means so many things to different folks. Two ways that this might come up for folks. One, genderqueer folks might like that label because it allows for more ambiguity. It's a little bit more of like a, you have to get to know me to figure out how this actually, how I experience this. So it allows for some ambiguity. Some genderqueer folks use the label genderqueer for themselves because they want to make a specific statement about their identity as being an intentional disruption of negative parts of the gender binary. So maybe being an intentional disruption of toxic masculinity, or an intentional disruption of patriarchy, or like it might be something that they're like really leaning into what their experience of gender means for how they act and how they work in the world. It's raining umbrellas. It is, Darren. So these are just a couple of the words that you might come across. There's way more than this, in the same way that when we're talking about like our larger community, we're adding more letters to our acronym every day, and that's a good thing. It's not like, because we're learning more about each other every day, right? So there's more than this for sure. But this is just sort of an overview of some of the words that you might hear. So how do we talk about these folks? What kind of language should we use or not use? The first thing is that trans is an adjective or a descriptor. So you would say somebody is a transgender person, not just a transgender. So this is something that like is, it's going to be different depending on what language you're speaking, but in English, this is kind of the way we talk about it, is as a descriptive word. So there's also no need to add an ED to the end of it. So like transgendered is something that you might see even like 6-7 years ago. You'll find it in books, like not maybe even 5 years ago. It's something that's been like slowly sort of phased out, because I think a lot of people realized that it didn't make sense to use transgender as an adjective and then have that ED on the end. It just like didn't logistically make sense. But more than that, it makes it sound like something terrible happened to you to make you trans, like you got hit by a bus and you got transgendered. So we've kind of moved away from using the ED on the end, but you might still see that. One of the reasons I bring that point up is because in organizations and churches that want to be inclusive and affirming of trans folks, or of any group, knowing what the current language is that's being used is really important. Because if you in your bulletin, for instance, say like, we welcome transgendered people, the trans person that walks into your community is going to be like, oh, they're a little behind the times. And that's going to like communicate something. So it's just good to know. So terms to be, I say careful with, in that like, not in the like never ever ever use it, because like some people use these words for themselves, but just being careful and gentle with them. Transsexual is a word to be kind of careful with, because some trans folks feel really strongly about using that for themselves. Transsexual versus transgender, that sort of argument back and forth was kind of distinguishing transsexual as a trans person who has medically transitioned, and then they would have like the label transsexual, versus transgender not requiring any sort of transition medically to be valid or real. And so there's been a little bit of like back and forth about that word. So for some folks, transsexual is like, yes, this is my word, I use it. And for other folks, it's like, nope, we don't use that one. So it's going to be an individual thing. The other phrase is sex change. So that's just a word or a phrase that people tend to not use too much anymore. I don't even know that many people, some people might describe their transition that way, but it's just not very common anymore. Now we'll generally talk about people who are changing how they're medically or socially perceived, changing any of those things. We talk about somebody as transitioning now is generally the word we use. And we talk about gender affirming surgery rather than sex change. So gender affirming surgery and transitioning are kind of the language that's used now. So let's talk for a second about transition here. Many trans people experience something called gender dysphoria. And I want to emphasize that not all trans people experience this, but it is a common experience. Gender dysphoria is a distress or dissonance caused by the difference between one's gender and one's assigned sex. Many trans people choose to transition in order to lessen dysphoria and move toward the opposite, euphoria. More Latin words, bringing them in. So with this sense of gender dysphoria, there's like lots of different ways that people might describe it. I kind of think of it as like, it's like if you know, the nails on a chalkboard feeling, what if you felt that internally like a lot? That's a little bit how it's like this friction between these two things. And the two things might be how you feel and how people perceive you, how you feel and how you perceive your own body. Like there's lots of different ways that gender dysphoria can show up for folks. So people might choose to transition in a couple of different ways, and none of this is required. So social transition may include things like name and pronoun changes, changes in clothing, hairstyle, other kinds of gender expression change. Medical transition might include hormone replacement therapy or gender affirming surgery or voice therapy. And then legal transition is including changing things like gender markers and documents and name and things like that on documents. And that's going to be the super difficult or near impossible in some places and super easy in other places. So same with medical transition, honestly. So just saying, really hammering home on the fact that not all trans people choose to transition. It's definitely not a requirement for being trans. Some people may choose one or two of these things or none of them. So here's the complex thing when we talk about our medical system. Being transgender is not a mental illness. However, the way that our medical system works, you are required to have a diagnosis before you can do any sort of medical transition. And a lot of times, legal transition requires parts of medical transition. So being trans is not a mental illness. However, we had to have, the medical establishment had to have some kind of diagnosis so that they could code it in and keep things like doctors from getting sued, right? So it's a complicated thing because sometimes people will point to the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual for mental health providers, and say, look, gender dysphoria is here in the manual. So clearly being trans is a medically an illness. And the reality is that what medical providers tried to do by changing from having gender identity disorder, which was the old thing that used to be in there, and they changed to gender dysphoria, is they were trying to say being trans is not a mental illness, but you're having this particular thing that is causing you distress, and it's more like a symptom. And so we want to help people alleviate this symptom. So that's basically the sort of half compromise that they came to, which people have a lot of different feelings about. So let's talk about some historical examples, because one of the things that I hear from folks is like, oh, there are so many more trans people now. Trans is a new thing. It's like a new social fad, et cetera, et cetera. Gender diversity has existed all over the place throughout human history. So we have all kinds of stories of folks. These are just two folks who you can read more about. Like I tried to pick some folks who you could find more stories about elsewhere. So Albert Cashier was a Union soldier who was assigned female but lived as male for most of his life. And you can find more information about him. Huehua is another person from the Zuni tribe in New Mexico, was a two-spirit person, and was the first gender expansive person or gender diverse person to meet a president, and that was in 1886. So when people are like, trans people are new, you can be like, actually, no, like gender expansive people, like we've been around. Huehua met the president, so like somebody new. Different indigenous folks all over the world have different understandings of what gender diversity and gender expansiveness can look like. And so that's something that I personally know a little bit more about in North America than other places in the world, but there's lots of other places in the world where gender diversity shows up too. It's important to note the ways that white supremacy and colonialism have often tried to erase gender diversity, because we have these stories it's that thing about how history is written by the victors, right? So there are many times when we read about stories of gender expansive folks around the world, and all we read about them are the stories of the people who killed them. So that's the case in this story with Vasco Nunez de Balboa and folks in Panama in 1513. Basically, what happened is this conquistador came over, saw these folks who he identified as, he saw them expressing themselves in what he thought was more feminine ways of doing gender, and basically said, well, these people must be what he would categorize as sodomites, because that was the only category that he had. So when folks come in any sort of situation where there's conquering and colonialism, and they come with their own ideas about how gender should work, the indigenous people in that place don't fit their understanding, and that usually ends pretty badly for the indigenous folks. So this is something that you can read more about, but it's hard because we don't have that many first person accounts, because a lot of times these things get burned and get destroyed before we get a chance to read them. There are quite a few examples of gender expansive and gender diverse folks in Christian history. We have quite a few folks who are saints, who are venerable or blessed, and are working their way towards sainthood. So Marius the monk is one of my favorite stories, just touching on this. Marius the monk was presented as male to take orders as a monk when he was a teenager. He was accused of impregnating a local innkeeper's daughter and was kicked out of the monastery because of it. He never recanted and tried to say well, I couldn't have done that. He chose to raise the child as his own and eventually got to rejoin the monastery with that child. And so he is now a saint, but that was in 5th century in what is now Syria. Madre Juana de la Cruz was born in Spain in the 15th century. And probably, looking back now, we guess that Madre Juana was intersex. She had physical sex characteristics that some of them were more masculine, some of them were more feminine. She became the mother of an abbey, and was one of the only women that was allowed to preach during the, oh no, I've lost the Spanish Inquisition, is what I'm trying to say. She was one of the only women allowed to preach during the Spanish Inquisition. And so her sermons, which are all about the gender, the messiness of gender within God and Jesus, have just recently been translated into English. And so now you can actually get a book of her sermons, which is really interesting. Oh, I love this depiction of her. She just looks, I don't know, she just looks like the kind of person that I would want to know. And then Joan of Arc, of course, is one of the folks that people point to a lot as an example of a gender expansive person in history. We don't know what Joan's gender experience was, but we know that she did dress more masculine in order to fight the English during the 100 Years' War. And she was first accused of heresy. And then when they couldn't prove that she had actually committed heresy, they decided to basically kill her for the sin of cross-dressing. And the question that has often been asked in the wake of that is whether she was ever provided any other clothes once she was captured. She might not have had any other clothes to wear. So there's a lot of interesting stuff about Joan and whether or not, what her gender experience was. So today, when we're thinking about trans and gender expansive folks today, what are some of the things that we can do to support our trans neighbors and siblings? So first of all, I think one of the things I think is helpful is to just know, what should you not say? So here are a couple of things to not say. Not asking people about surgery. Something that you would not, ask about somebody else's. Just generally don't ask questions about people's bodies that are invasive. That's pretty basic, but it happens to trans folks a lot. Asking about real name or birth name. The reason that you wouldn't want to ask somebody that is not because trans people are trying to hide things, but because lots of trans people have negative experiences with their birth name. And so we want to be careful of asking folks, like, I think the problem is that most folks see that as a very benign question, especially people that are like just interested in names and meanings. They might not think anything of saying like, oh, well, what was your name before? And remembering that this can be a really heavy and difficult thing for some folks to talk about. It's not a sort of an idle question. I never would have guessed, or you look great for a trans person. These sort of backhanded compliments are like, we know people mean well, but what you end up saying is, I assume all trans people look this way, and I also assume all trans people look bad. There's some things about like passing, quote unquote, which means like, can people tell if you're trans or not? And that's a whole conversation in and of itself. And so having cisgender folks sort of put expectations on people and how they look is something we want to be really careful with. I once heard the really great rule of thumb that you should never criticize something about how somebody looks that can't be fixed in 10 seconds. So like if they have something in their teeth, go for it. If you think they should have cut their hair a different way, maybe don't say anything about that. And then lastly, thinking about the ways that we put expectation, like we feel maybe uncomfortable in saying how we feel about something, and so then we put that onto somebody else. I think this happens. So I'm from the Midwest. I live in Minnesota. We do this all the time where we're like, well, I think that's great, but like, what about so-and-so and what they think? And it's like, well, no, you're really explaining that you're not comfortable with this. So like owning the fact that we might be uncomfortable with something and that that's our thing to work on. That's not something that is the problem of the person who's standing in front of us. If we feel uncomfortable with something, that's maybe something that we need to think about. So things that you can ask: what's your name? Just period. What name do you use? Can you remind me of your pronouns? If you forget somebody's pronouns, it's okay to ask for a reminder. In general, asking for somebody's pronouns we want to be aware that that can be a delicate thing. Like we try to encourage people to do that in general, like people are encouraged to think about asking for pronouns, but we also want to be aware of the context in which we are asking for those pronouns. Because if you're asking for somebody to tell you something about them or their gender in a space that is not safe for them to talk about that thing, that can actually put them in more of a, not just a dangerous position, but like a difficult position. So asking about things like pronouns or asking about gender, we want to be aware of the situation that we're asking in. How can I support you with that? And then is there a good resource you'd recommend on that? Rather than asking somebody to explain their whole life to you right in that moment, just be like, hey, do you have a good book I could read on that? That's way better, because somebody's, folks are just trying to live their life. They don't need to spend time educating you right when you want it. Maybe you can do that later, but like asking for a book or a resource can be a way to keep learning without putting the pressure on the person you're talking to. So pronouns, like we said, lots of folks are getting more comfortable with pronouns. I notice a lot of folks in our group today are using they pronouns. I still run into a lot of people that have a huge problem with they pronouns, they, them, theirs as singular pronouns. And so I still have to kind of be like, all right, y'all, we've got some precedent for this. It's going to be okay. Nobody panic. So for instance, in English, we tend to think of only having his or hers pronouns, right? And thinking about the fact that like they, them, theirs has to be for multiple people. But that's not true. Even within English history, lots of folks, well-recognized folks like Chaucer and Shakespeare and Jane Austen, have used they as a singular pronoun. So if you're an English teacher and you're kind of like having a pearl clutching moment, like there's good precedent for this. This is not a totally new thing. In fact, the word you for a singular person is sometimes newer than using they for singular. The word you rather than thou, which thou used to be what you would use, and then people started using you, and now we don't even think about it. So language changes. The thing to always be mindful of is, I remember a friend of mine who used to teach like premarital coaching classes for couples that were getting ready to get married. And this friend of mine always said, the most important thing I always tell my couples are to remember, when you're having a fight about something, ask yourself the question, Would I rather be right or would I rather be in relationship? And I think that's a great way of thinking about this. Would you rather argue about who's right or would you rather love the person that's standing in front of you? So, yes, I just noticed that thing that we just put this in. I can't read, my text window is too small, from Lauren. Thank you, Lauren, for sharing that experience. So when we're thinking about pronouns, there's more than just he and she, and there's also more than just he, she, and they. There's all kinds of pronouns. There are more options all the time that people are kind of like trying to figure out what they want to use. So the rule of thumb is always to treat somebody treat somebody as you would want to be treated, in that you use the words that they want you to use, but treat them how they want to be treated in that, like, you actually use the things that they ask you for, right? So even if you're like, I would never use that for myself, well, that's okay. They're not you. They're a different person. So these are just some examples of some other pronouns that people might use. One more thing I'll say about pronouns, which is that oftentimes we really want to use the right pronouns for people and we just goof up in the moment. If you goof up somebody's pronouns, don't make a huge deal about it, because it takes 2 seconds to get somebody's pronoun wrong. And then if you spend the next 10 minutes apologizing for it, that makes it way worse. So just go, oh, sorry, and correct yourself and move on. You don't have to make a huge deal about it, because that can make people feel even more uncomfortable. And also, if you are really and honestly trying to get somebody's pronouns right and you goof up, don't beat yourself up too much, because the way our brains work is we have neural pathways that connect things in our brains. And the only way we can learn how to do something is by repeating a neural pathway over and over. So the best way to learn to use somebody's pronouns, to use the right pronouns for somebody, is to say them out loud with your mouth. So if you're like, I'm really bad at using they, them pronouns, right? Or really bad at using ze, pronouns, but I have this friend who wants to use these pronouns and I want to support them in that. Practice the pronouns like verbally, like when you're in the shower or when you're driving, like when you're by yourself. You don't have to feel like self-conscious, because when you say them with your mouth, it's the same reason we tell kids to like say their flashcards out loud. When you say them with your mouth, you strengthen those neural pathways, and then over and over and over time, you'll get way better at it. Yes, true, Darren. You can also just get with a friend and just practice saying sentences. So things you can do if somebody tells a rude joke or says something negative about somebody. These are just some different ways you can respond. You can ask somebody why they think the joke is funny, because then they have to explain why they're being a jerk. Well, it's funny because all trans people look this way. Well, no, they don't. You can just specifically say, hey, that's not okay, and just like specifically draw that boundary. You can draw a boundary around space, saying something like, I don't want to be around people who say stuff like that. You can offer an alternative, say, what if we use blank instead? And you can help people explain or help people understand why what's going on is not an okay thing to say. So sometimes one of the things that works best for me, if I'm like in a situation where I know somebody isn't intentionally being a jerk, they just don't know any better, is I put it back on myself and I say, well, I used to say this thing. I used to think this was right. And then I learned so-and-so, and I realized that was the wrong thing to do. So then I put it on myself, so it doesn't make them feel as bad, but it's like modeling what you should do instead. So all these are ways that we can kind of like encourage people to put their best foot forward in conversation. Another thing we can do to support trans folks is use inclusive language. And there's a couple different ways we can do that. We can use inclusive language about God. So when we're thinking about God and how, like, the language that we use for God, when we talk about God and then we talk about people who are made in God's image, if we talk about God as only male, then we end up privileging people who are male. If we end up talking about God in restrictive ways when it comes to gender, we will be more restrictive about people and the way that they experience gender. So thinking about how we talk about God really does change how we treat other people. And so we can use more expansive language in liturgy to help us think more broadly. So that doesn't necessarily mean never use he, him pronouns for God and never use words like Lord or Father, because I think people do have, like, some people really do resonate with those words. And we also don't, like, from my experience as like a biblical scholar, I don't want to take words from the Bible and try to make them what I want them to be, or like try to take them away from the original writers. Like, I want to be careful of that. But I think we can add to the possibilities here. So not saying, hey, never use these words, but rather saying, hey, let's create more of a like potluck of words. Like, what if we add in some she's and hers, and like, let's use some like feminine and non-gendered language for God, and just sort of mix that in there. And that can make a big difference in church and worshiping communities. So when we're talking about language about communities, rather than saying things like brothers and sisters, we can use the word siblings, or we can just add siblings to the list. So if you want to use brothers and sisters, you could say brothers and sisters and siblings in Christ, right? So just adding that word is really helpful when we want to make sure that people feel seen and included. Because when you're talking to a group of folks and you're only using brothers and sisters, or you're only talking about, ladies and gentlemen or whatever, it makes folks in the community who do not use those words feel like they shouldn't be there, feel like they're sort of usurping, or that they need to be sneaky, or like that they shouldn't talk about who they are. So using inclusive language for our community is really important, so that everybody feels like they can be seen and can interact. And then finally, language in music. And this is a tough one, because music, you have to deal with things like rhyming words and meter and things like that when we're thinking about our songs. But we can think about how we organize music. So rather than saying like men sing this verse, women sing this verse, you can do high voices and low voices. You can also think about how we talk about the lyrics that we use can be changed. So I love this change by Eleanor Hull, where she was like, hang on a second, be thou my vision. It's like this classic song, but like this thing about thy my great father and I thy true son, like, feels weird to have everybody singing that if they don't identify as sons. So change it to thou my redeemer, my love, thou hast won. So like, there's this complex thing about like meter and rhyme that you have to deal with, but it's well worth it, I think, when we think about making sure that everybody can sing together and can feel like they can be wholeheartedly participating. And I'm sure Darren could tell you a lot more about that, because the Many does an amazing job with language. So lastly here, these are sort of like my top 7 things for churches that, like, if churches or worshiping communities are thinking about being more trans inclusive, including trans people in church leadership. Just like there is a glass ceiling in the working world, there is also sort of a rainbow cathedral ceiling that a lot of us are familiar with about, like, you can be in this church, but you can't lead, you can't be in charge of stuff. So having trans people in church leadership, educating your leaders and your greeters. So if somebody gets misgendered at the door, they're less likely to come back next Sunday, right? So educating greeters on things like this is important, and leaders in general. Creating gender inclusive facilities, using inclusive language, having a welcoming statement and a non-discrimination policy, redistributing resources to trans people through donations and partnerships with local orgs. I really emphasize that for churches because not everything can be fixed with better language and therapy. Some things are systemic issues that we have to do some redistribution around. And then finally, regularly including resources and theology related to gender diversity in your preaching, Bible studies, and youth curriculum. So there we go. So that's it. And then we can go into some questions, because I see Darren's got one here already. So feel free to reach out. You can find me all over the internet. You can email me. Go check out Transmission Ministry Collective if you're looking for support groups and things like that for trans and gender expansive Christians. And I think that's all I have on this slide. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.